Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Greg Woodward, Senior Manager of Waterway Health at the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in Victoria, Australia. My presentation today is Managing Victoria's Estuaries, a Policy Perspective. But before I begin, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on where I'm presenting from today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So in the presentation today, I'll give a quick background on Victoria's estuaries. I'll then discuss the development of estuary policy and management direction in Victoria, including teasing out one particular policy challenge we faced around artificial estuary openings. And finally, I'll take a look at what lies ahead for estuary policy in Victoria. So in Victoria, we have more than 100 estuaries, 83 of which exceed 1 kilometre in length. Many of our estuaries close intermittently, which is a natural feature of the Victorian coastline, and this can be critical to the ecology and also the physical form of our estuaries. In Victoria, estuary condition varies greatly across the state. We do have a good number of estuaries in good and excellent condition, and these are often associated with forested areas. However, for the majority that are downstream of urbanised and agricultural landscapes, these typically have a poorer environmental condition. So like all estuaries across the world, our estuaries possess many environmental, social and economic values. Our estuaries have long been important to Victorian traditional owners and many contain sites of cultural significance. Many estuaries across Victoria were among the first areas to be settled by non-Indigenous people, and these early settlements have since developed into some of Victoria's most densely populated areas, which is probably a good segue into our next slide on threats. So Victoria's estuaries also face many of the usual threats. So habitat modification, pest species, pollution, unpermitted entrance openings, changes to water regimes, etc. The list goes on. So how does Victoria manage for all of these threats? Well, up until 2013, you could probably say that there was definitely room for improvement. Until that point, estuary management direction was set by the Victorian Coastal Strategy and the Victorian River Health Strategy. But these did not specifically recognise the uniqueness of estuaries, meaning that the planning, management and policy direction was a bit light on and probably a little bit disjointed. So I guess you could say up until this point, estuaries were really managed the same way as the rest of the river, which of course is not ideal. So what happened next? A defining moment for Victorian estuary management occurred in 2013 with the release of the Victorian Waterway Management Strategy. The strategy included a dedicated estuary chapter that provided a consistent direction for their management. It also set out a clear management framework and identified specific policy and actions for improved knowledge, increasing community awareness, and direction for tackling specific estuary management issues, including improved environmental condition, determining estuary environmental water requirements, which is informed by the Estuary Environmental Flows Assessment Methodology Decision Support Tool, or otherwise known as EFAM. And finally, managing estuary entrances and artificial opening. And it's this last one that I'd like to talk a bit more about. So estuary closures and associated flooding of surrounding land is a natural and an ecologically important process. But of course, not everyone is happy when it occurs. That flooding and prolonged inundation can have social and economic impacts on adjacent agricultural and residential land, roads and structures such as bridges, jetties and boat ramps. Prior to 2013, waterway managers had no specific guidance on actually how to manage this issue. And this often led to members of the public taking things into their own hands by undertaking unauthorised openings. And some of these led to large fish death events. So to help address the problem, the Victorian Waterway Management Strategy outlines principles, policy, actions, and a framework to manage this issue. So as I've mentioned prior, in Victoria, we recognise the environmental benefits of estuary closures and the importance of the natural opening regime. However, if an artificial opening is requested or required, it only occurs if the weather and the physical conditions allow for a safe and an effective opening, and a risk-based assessment of the environmental, social and economic values is conducted. So in Victoria, we've developed the Estuary Entrance Management Support System Tool, or EEMS, to help waterway managers undertake this assessment. So, as well as incorporating environmental assets, the population of the tool involves working with the impacted stakeholders and landholders to identify their assets and what heights their assets are impacted. In a way, this process has helped all participants at least get a better understanding of the bigger picture. And for those wondering at the photos at the bottom, they're just some of the ways we artificially open our estuaries in Victoria. So most of the time we use machinery, but in the case of the centre photo there, we sometimes have to use explosives. And on the right, there was one time when we even used the Australian and the Fijian armies to lend a hand with some shovels. Okay, so in terms of management implementation, the strategy sets out policy and a framework for this process. It outlines the waterway manager and stakeholder responsibilities, a model for funding arrangements that centres around the beneficiary pay system, a process to establish formal agreements among stakeholders, so for example, MOUs, and specific policy and actions to address opening triggers. So essentially, you're removing the need to artificial open estuaries for non-environmental reasons by doing that. So for example, you may be establishing landholder agreements to allow extended periods of inundation or raise the level of infrastructure such as roads and jetties. So looking ahead, the Victorian Waterway Management Strategy is currently up for renewal, and we're just about to start the process for updating the estuary chapter. It's likely that the big issues we'll be facing Victoria are climate change impacts related to both reduced flows as well as sea level rise. And these impacts will also influence habitat and the frequency and duration of estuary mouth openings. So it's likely we'll need to revisit this policy space as well. Also, increasing urbanisation is another creeping threat our estuaries are facing and requires more focus, particularly in the planning space. Anyway, that was just a quick overview of how we manage our estuaries in Victoria. Thanks for listening, and please remember that I'm always happy to speak to anyone who has any questions about my presentation today. So thank you very much.